Good morning. My fear in coming to these things is always that I'll be a part of a panel that nobody shows up for, so thank you all for assuaging those fears today. My name is Rodney Grubbs. I am a Fed from NASA at Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama, and I'll be moderating our panel today. Excuse the glasses, but I've reached that age where I can't read anything without them. This session is Making UHD Video Streaming a Reality, Success Stories from NASA TV UHD. Our panelists today, my colleague Bryan also from Marshall Space Flight Center, Joel Marsden from Harmonic. He's a video producer and executive producer of NASA TV UHD. Thierry Fautier, did I get that right? Vice President Video Strategy at Harmonic and President of the Ultra HD Forum. David MacPhie, Sales Director of Accedo, and Rob Roskin, Managing Principal Solutions Architect for CenturyLink's content business. So 3 years ago at NAB, I was standing in a booth talking to some colleagues, and some gentlemen walked over from the Harmonic booth nearby, and they said, are you the guys from NASA TV? And we said, yes. And they said, well, we've got an interesting idea that we would like to propose to you. And the idea was that we understand you have a lot of 4K content, and we would like to demonstrate how to create a UHD channel, to create the first ever UHD channel via satellite. One of the reasons why they came to us to talk to us is because we had all of this content, and it's free to the public and doesn't have the burdens of all these licensing with it, and we were interested in trying to figure out ways of getting that content out to more people. We had been shooting in 4K or higher, dating all the way back to the end of the shuttle era, because we used that kind of content for engineering and science. So after the Columbia accident, we had begun shooting and experimenting with high-speed cameras, 2K and 4K cameras, in order to get better imagery of launches, to see if we could see incidences during shuttle launches. We were doing high dynamic range long before high dynamic range was cool, because if you ever see a rocket launch at night, it's as bright as the sun, but the area that you're interested in is just up above that rocket nozzle. And so for years and years and years, we had been shooting high-speed motion picture film, motion picture negative film, so we could get the high dynamic range. And we were doing lots of experiments at the end of the shuttle program looking at digital solutions to replace the film. So here we had all this content, and we were interested in getting it to more eyeballs, and along come these gentlemen from Harmonic saying, hey, we've got a cool idea. And the result was what we call a Space Act agreement. It's a non-exclusive agreement that basically says, hey, NASA's going to make this content available to you, and then Harmonic put together the technology to create a NASA TV UHD channel, and it sits alongside our existing NASA TV channels via satellite. So one of the things that we were particularly interested in looking at now for the future is how do we take advantage of some of this HDR content and make it available, because that's not an easy thing to do via satellite. We've been doing this UHD channel now for 2.5 years, give or take a few months, and Joel will talk a little bit more about the content on that here in just a second. Just recently, several announcements were made at NAB where instead of just the North American satellite footprint that we had for NASA television, there are now several other ways of seeing the NASA TV UHD channel worldwide, basically taking that same feed and redistributing it on different satellites. Intelsat, Eutelsat, and SES are now also redistributing that channel, and so that's getting the native NASA TV UHD channel out to more eyes around the world. And a lot of this content is kind of visual wallpaper, if you will, and Joel will talk a little bit about that as well. And so here we have a short period of time and a lot of content, so I'll go pretty quick with everybody, and we will set the stage a little bit with our conventional NASA TV streaming, and then move on from there. So, Bryan?
So Currently, we are sending to satellite 3 live channels. There's a NASA TV public education channel, which is focused, its content that we want the public to see directly. The media channel, which we have a lot of content that we hope that the media will pick up and redistribute, and also the NASA TV UHD channel. At our satellite provider, where we do our playout and our uplink, we also do our streaming for the 2 HD channels. And so we encode currently to Akamai, IBM Cloud, YouTube Live, and to Teradek Core. And currently, our distribution, if you go to www.nasa.gov, you can find we're using a player provided by MobileWriter, which is an Akamai reseller. We also have the NASA app out there. And from the Teradek Core, we can then redirect. We use it for going to places like Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, all of the other social outlets where we don't keep the channel running all the time. We just do events there. And if somebody comes to us and asks us, we would like to have NASA content on our social feed, we can go from there. There are some persistent channels that redistribute our channel as well, and we can do all of those from there as well. But obviously, beyond the HD, we'd like to be able to do the UHD, and looking at that previously, there hasn't been an obvious way to get there. So I'll hand it over.
Yeah, so when we basically started the Space Act Agreement, we had to imagine how can we present this content in all its glory, right? That's the key here, is that NASA has been shooting things in UHD for a while, so these raw files exist, and we started to think about how to package this into a new series that would then specifically be eye candy. That's kind of the way we're approaching it, is to have this, you know, high resolution, HDR, and to create compelling content with that. So what we did is we've come up with 8 new series that speak to all the different parts of NASA programs, both current and historical. And to introduce that to you, let me show you a trailer.
All right.
So this gives you a little overview of the 8 new series that we've created. We did kind of hit a lot of challenges as we started to create these shows. So when you start working in UHD and HDR, what you end up noticing is that you see absolutely everything, right? Every detail, especially once you have it on one of those nice 65-inch screens. And so we had to deal with all kinds of unforeseen things. For instance, the cameras that are flying on the International Space Station, the sensors get hit with cosmic rays. So you end up with dead pixels in the sensor. And so, for instance, for some of the batches that we got of the materials, we had to create, we ended up using like a wire removal filter, but we had to paint out like 800 individual pixels, per shot at times and fix that up. Other things, we have a deep space show that's mainly Hubble imagery. And some of those images are like 60,000 by 60,000 pixels, so they're huge files that we then animate. But again, it was quite taxing on our machines to try to generate materials out of that. But ultimately, it's really, to me, quite gratifying because you get to see NASA's work and the space program in a completely different way. It's the HDR aspect of this, which was a big learning curve for us as well, is well worth it. So I'm a huge fan of UHD HDR because you can see the solid blacks of deep space as well as detail in the brightest parts of a plume of a rocket, for instance. So it really is an ideal format for this and a great way to present NASA. And ultimately, one of the nicest comments that I got was when we presented this at the press club in DC a little while back. Colonel Wirtz, one of the ISS astronauts, was there and saw the materials, and he shot a lot of the materials as well. And he ultimately said, this is as close as what I've seen from the actual ISS. So that's what, I guess, ultimately our goal, in terms of creating this content is to share that experience with everybody so that you can feel like an astronaut yourself a little bit. And there's, of course, been a lot of technical challenges with delivering this content. And perhaps, Thierry, you could talk a little bit to that.
Yep, thank you. So on this diagram, you'll see the complete workflow. And this is linear channel and VOD. So it's the first time you see a live HDR UHD delivery over the public internet. So what we do, we are basically putting a scheduler to take the video files we are grading offline, and then we bring all those files into a new workflow, which is based on the playlist manipulation of VOD asset, and this is something we are integrating into our VOS 360 platform. If you are a content provider, we can host your content exactly the same as we do for NASA, and we can give you a live experience, a linear experience, and therefore go beyond VOD. You know that people, they like to push a button and then look at the experience. And if they don't like it, they want to go to VOD, and from VOD, they want to go to live. So it's a very compelling experience, and you'll see later on the slide. This is an architecture that supports multiple types of HDR. So we are today supporting HDR10 and HLG because this is what the device supports. We can, of course, support more formats coming forward. This is now going to a CenturyLink CDN. So it's an HTTP-HLS classical streaming. And then this is now being played back on different devices, and this is what Accedo is going to present, and you will see what is the user experience on those devices.
Great, yeah, thank you. So yeah, I'm from a company called Accedo. We build that front-end consumer-facing experience. And in this particular case, obviously, with the beautiful content that was being shot, the focus was to make sure we started with a device that was going to support UHD very well, but also to render that on a big 10-foot experience. So we chose to start with Roku. And we built the apps using a product of ours called Studio. Studio is a platform that lets our content providers build apps, deploy them natively, but to actually build and manage them through a cloud-based platform. And the reason that's important here, and important for a lot of content providers, is that if you think about the cool stuff being done with NASA and the sort of editorial or calendar-based events that might be very relevant, such as launches or the eclipse, it'll allow Joel and the team to actually go into the app, make edits dynamically to highlight that content, and then take them back down later. And that's kind of a relatively new thing in the app space, which traditionally have been native code deployed on a device that you couldn't necessarily easily manipulate. So that's been our role here, and I think there's more app deployments to be happening in the future across other platforms, but you can see the experience here. So initially, there's the live stream, which is obviously kind of the most compelling and instantly gratifying when you launch the app, but there's a variety of these different shows and content categories that are available as well. It's a very cool experience.
Sorry. So I'm going to speak a little bit about how we get all this data around the world. We see all the points of presence on the map here, and the gist is that we're moving from what used to be at the beginning SD content. We then got into HD, which is 4 times the size. But now we're not only quadrupling the size of the content again, we're adding in HDR, which adds in additional data for every frame about the color spectrum and how bright to make everything, as well as 60 frames per second, which is pretty much standard across all of this content. So we've now more than quadrupled the file size, and we still have the expectation from the customer of needing to get this content out almost immediately. As we talked about, the live part of the app is considered the instant gratification. And we say instant, these days we mean it. We expect things to come up in about a second, maybe a little under a second, and to be fully playable. And with UHD content, the expectation is that that would be in 4K, in HDR, at 60 frames per second, right about as soon as you turn the stream on. So the ability to get all of that content around and these file sizes, to turn it back into thinking of these things as just HLS and dash segments for a minute, these are much larger segments than traditionally we would get. And even in an ABR profile, people are coming to this content to see it in UHD. The goal of this is not just to see, we were using a football example earlier when we were speaking, and the goal of this is not just to be able to see the game. The goal is to be able to see this content in the best possible quality. So giving a user an SD content of a shuttle launch is not really what they're here for. They have that already. It's a lot less compelling. So our mission was to be able to get this content moved around the world through our fiber network as fast as possible. And in order to do that, we had to make tweaks to our servers to allow things like TCP buffer sizes to change. We had to allow more windowing and some other technical TCP changes to really get this content solid and immediately available in your app, in your browser, in your mobile network, while you're on a bus. It's a challenge. But we've been able to expand our network, expand our peering points across the world, and really embrace the fact that this stuff has to happen fast. And that's kind of where we've come along in this challenge. We now believe that we have the network that's set up for 4K, and this is kind of our first use case of it. So hopefully you guys will agree with me when you go download the app.
All right, so we went fairly quickly so that we could have some time for some questions, and hopefully a few of you have a few. Any immediate questions? Otherwise, I have a couple that I'll get things started. Yes?
What bit rate do I need at home on my broadband connection to watch?
So the question is, what bit rate do you need at home to watch this?
So, okay, so maybe I can give you some references today. If you watch the Olympics or the soccer game, you probably need 25 megabits per second. That's what you need to have today for existing service. Because this content is a bit less challenging, we think between 15 and 10 megabits per second. I don't know if you have heard about the new technology per title encoding, content-aware encoding. You can expect in the near future to be below 10 megabits per second. At 10 megabits per second, I think in the US you can probably reach 70% of the population. But I will let CenturyLink tell you how great they are.
So yeah, we've seen that the average home broadband can handle 10 megabits per second in real world situations. I mean, I know we all buy 100 or a gig, but let's be serious. During prime time, you see that you can get 10 megabits per second pretty reliably. And there's been some changes to some of the codecs and encoder settings, as you were referencing, that have made us be able to keep it at that range. For example, right now, Game of Thrones would top out at 8.5 megabits per second. Yet this content, because of some new technologies, we're going to be able to keep it around 10 megabits per second and still give you all the 4K benefits of the UHD and the frame rates, all that stuff, the HDR. But when you get to 15 or 20, to your point, it really, the broadband penetration really slows down. So I think that the goal here is 10 megabits per second, and that should be achievable for almost everybody in this room.
Any other questions? While you're thinking, Joel, so there's two standards, if you will, for HDR. Can you talk a little bit about the challenge of, or is it a challenge to master in both, since there are both standards out there, both are typically supported by the set-top boxes and television sets?
Yeah, it's still a bit of a wild west out there when it comes to HDR, but so what we've decided to do is master these shows in HDR10 and in HLG as well for right now. Ultimately, I think we're going to have HDR10 and SDR multicast so that you can pull both streams. HLG is very good because it's backwards compatible. So there's certainly advantages there, but not all televisions are compatible yet with it, especially in the US. The penetration isn't that high yet of HLG. It's mainly in the UK and in Japan. So we've done a lot of HDR work these last 2 years, and I think the key is also not to be too intimidated by it. There's an expanded color space, BT 2020, that we're dealing with, so you really get much more, it looks more like real life. Obviously, you can get the brightnesses up to like 1,000 nits, which is incredible for some of these rocket launches or other, content that has lots of brights and darknesses. So the formats are tremendous, and I think the key there is to just set up a proper post-production workflow that is sort of a contained HDR workflow, where you can do all this work. The danger is to start mixing the two formats, and then you get strange results. And then what you would do is go and grade your HDR10 first, and then you can apply different LUTs to get your HLG and your SDR grades as well. And just in terms of future-proofing the content, we've done it in all formats, just so that we have it and don't have to go back and mess with it.
Yes, sir.
How many bits per pixel are you using to
10. This is
The question was how many bits per
yeah.
pixel?
So the color space is BT 2020, 10 bits, HEVC main 10, and this is what everybody used. I think Joel mentioned HDR is, you can basically fork on HDR10, HLG. I think technically we have not seen much difference between the two.
No, I think you can make them both look the same, but you have to be at minimum 10-bit.
10 bits.
Yes, sir.
Is there any difference between the live streams and the VODs in terms of bit rates, quality?
Yes.
Did everybody hear the question?
HDR?
Yes, so the question is about VOD versus live. So here, everything, the workflow, we didn't go too much into detail because we only gave us 30 minutes. We have to complain officially. But what's interesting is that this is a VOD workflow. So we take the file, we encode, we grade it, and we put that as a linear channel. If you look at the live channel, it's a different workflow. But I would say, in general, when you do a file-based encoding, you can reduce the bit rate because you can do multipass. What we tend to do is, because we have so many assets to encode, we try to use the same compression technology for live and file. I just came back out of the Olympics, and I was listening to my friend at NBC telling me the speed for UHD encoding in ABR is way too slow. They want fast turnaround, which means they would like to see live-like in terms of processing speed. So yes, you can do lower bit rate and more computation, and no, you don't want to wait a day to get an hour. If you are in the production, I think you will understand what I mean. You come the next day to see the result, and then you see, oh, this is not good, I need to launch a new batch. So it would be good to have the workflow that is fast, and what we show here is a file-based workflow that gives a linear experience.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
What challenges are there in, for example, the International Space Station
So the question was about the challenges of using cameras in space. Joel touched on one. The cosmic rays, the ionizing radiation damages the sensors, also damages the astronauts and everything else on board. And so different cameras behave a little bit differently, and we're not really 100% sure why. We know that CMOS sensors perform better than CCD sensors, and pixel pitch makes a difference. But in general, after a year or a year and a half in space, a sensor will have probably more dead pixels than is manageable to fix. We have now flown 4 red cameras. They tend to perform pretty well compared to others that we've done. In fact, Joel, you're going to have more pixels to work with. We just flew the red weapon. Flying something called a weapon, by the way, is a challenge in NASA. When the paperwork goes across and they see, what is this? So that's an 8K version of the red camera. The crew haven't unpacked that yet, but looking forward to seeing that. The other issue that we've been having recently is with the lithium batteries. If you pay attention to what's going on with air flights, for example, and restrictions on lithium batteries are known by the safety people to be little compact bombs. And if they fail in a certain way, they become blowtorches. If you go out on YouTube, you can find wonderful examples of that. And a blowtorch on the space station would be a really, really bad thing. And so the batteries we've been using on the red cameras, they're asking us to bring those home and go with smaller ones, which will mean changing them out or using station power. When we first flew the reds, the crew had a tough time with them because they're used to commercial off-the-shelf video cameras with small sensors that have very large depth of field. Red camera, digital cinema camera is it's a professional camera, and it has a very shallow depth of field. So a lot of the early stuff, and Joel noticed this as well, you can see as the crew gets more used to it, they've realized, okay, I have to really be precise on my focus. So those are some of the main challenges with using these types of cameras.
Well, also, I know earlier on, the pipe of getting the footage down was a bit narrow, right?
Right.
So you guys leaned towards resolution over frame rate. So some of the initial stuff was shot at 24 frames so that we could have UHD, and then we had to extrapolate that to make it 5994. So that was a...
Yeah, our pipe in the beginning was limited to 300 megabits per second. Actually, originally it was 50, and then 150, and then 300. And have we implemented 600 yet, or we haven't turned that on yet, right?
I think it's very close.
So pretty soon we'll have a 600 megabit per second pipe from the station. So what typically happens is that the crew will attach the flash drive or the SSD to a computer, and then ground controllers on the ground will bring the files back while the crew's asleep, so that there's more bandwidth available. Yes, sir.
Can you speak a little more about your efforts to maybe make this content available through more video services, both live linear and VOD, and maybe on more apps for more devices, especially mobile?
Well, from the NASA perspective, of course, our agreement with Harmonic is non-exclusive, so we're always open to ideas that people might have. Bryan can talk real quickly about some of the other apps that we're doing.
And I'll also mention that I'm planning to have NASA put out an announcement looking for anybody that is interested in partnering with NASA for some innovative things that you could do with our content. But essentially, we're glad to make the content available for free, and we'll work with you to get it to you, or how you can pull it, especially if you're going to be hosting it yourself or using it on your own, where it isn't a continual cost for us. But we are expanding. We're trying to make the NASA app available on as many platforms as possible, so that's rolling out slowly. And we'd like to add this content to the existing NASA app as well as the separate standalone app.
Yeah, I'm interested in, iPhone, iOS, HDR, AMOLED displays, the new Android devices as well with the HDR, AMOLED displays.
Yeah, and we are, we've picked Roku as our first platform, but iOS is clearly a target as well, and really all platforms down the line. So it's going to be more a matter of rolling that out over the course of the next year or so, and ultimately we want to hit all of them.
Yeah, so I mean, certainly with what we do, the extension into the iOS stack, whether it's tvOS, Apple TV, or the iOS and iPad, to the Android stack with Fire TV, Android TV, and then the phones, and again, tablet, to smart TVs like Samsung, Vizio, et cetera. I mean, they all have app ecosystems, and they're all possible distribution points.
So I'm getting the universal cut sign. I want to be respectful for the next panel, but there's some gentlemen over here that have some questions. So you can meet us right outside here afterwards if you have any other follow-on questions. And I wish we had more time. I appreciate everybody's interest. And again, it's nice to actually see people showing up for one of these things. So thank you very much for attending.